Good afternoon. Today we are now going to be bringing in our last speaker. Dr. Michele Lanan is the former Deep Springs Chair of the Natural Sciences and is currently a professor of practice in entomology at the University of Arizona. Her research explores how insects with plants and microbes have influenced the evolution and morphology and behavior, including collective organizations and colony-level decision-making in ants. The dynamic of plant-ant interactions and the effect of diet on the evolution of ant gut morphology. She has broad interests in natural history and the intersection of art and science. Now with that, please help me welcome Dr. Michele Lanan. Thank you.
Hi, y'all. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this great conference. This has been a real treat. So I'm not a tree scientist. I'm an entomologist, and I work on insects. But because I work on insects, I naturally am always thinking about trees. So here I am, and I'm going to kind of take us on a change of pace and step back from the here and now and the nitty-gritty of tree care and trees and look at the big picture. So I'm going to try and walk you through what we know about the whole history of insects and trees on this planet. And this is a story about coevolution. This is a story about species that have interacted with each other so tightly through time and put pressures on each other and helped each other out in different ways that you cannot tease them apart. You can't tell the story of how trees evolved on Earth without telling the story of insects and vice versa. Now, putting that aside for a second, I want to make clear that this is an evolving story. We are constantly learning new things in the sciences about what happened in the past, and we will never have a complete picture because most of the information on what happened is gone. 99.9999% of all the things that ever lived didn't fossilize, and all their atoms have been reused many times and turned into different things. And so this is the best story that we can currently tell with what we currently know, but as you'll see, we're discovering new things all the time. So how do I tell a story about something that takes place in deep time over such long time spans that they're really hard to wrap the human mind around? We have trouble conceptualizing time beyond our own lifespan, maybe a few lifespans. I can think back to I can imagine ancient Rome. That was a long time ago. But we're going to talk about billions of years. And so the way that I like to sort of put billions of years in this long time span in context is this. This is an artist's drawing of the Milky Way galaxy. We don't have any photos of it because we've never left our solar system, so we've never gotten a camera out there. And I've put a little yellow dot to represent our sun. And our sun is about halfway out one of the spiral arms of the galaxy. And this whole thing is rotating in space. And the sun is actually orbiting the gigantic black hole in the center of our galaxy about once every 230 million years. So 250 million years or so. So that is a galactic year. And if we ask then, well, how old is the sun? And how old is the Earth in galactic years? How many times has it gone around? The Earth and the sun have gone around the center of the galaxy about 19 times. So it's 19 galactic years old. And no, it doesn't go in a spiral. I drew a spiral on this picture because I wanted you to be able to see the 19 rotations. It's going in the same orbit. Okay, so the Earth is 19. That's cool. How about life? Life on this planet. We have evidence of life, microbial life, going back now about 3.8 billion years. So in this one, I've colored all the spirals where life was on the planet in some form, green. So life has gone around the center of the galaxy at least 16.4 times. So that's pretty old, right? Life showed up on this planet pretty quickly after the planet coalesced out of a big ball of lava. Now, how about multicellular life? So my yellowish line here is representing multicellular life. And that's gone around about 3 years. So there was a long, long period of time that geologists called the boring billions, really, where not a lot was happening on this planet. All life was microscopic. And then finally, we're getting to things that we might call animals. For true animals, things that are related to animals we have today, that move around, that have a head, that include the arthropods and the insects, we know that they've been around for at least 540 million years. So 2 1/3 times around the galactic center. All right, now let's get to the insects, my favorite. Insects have shown up on this planet very early among the animals. In fact, they're among some of the earliest animals. Their relatives, the arthropods, the crustaceans, the spiders, things like that, show up right at the beginning of animal life. And they have been on this planet. This has been their planet. Earth is the planet of the bugs for 480 million years. They've gone around the center of this galaxy, 2 full times. Now, how about our relatives? We're primates. We're, mammal things, primates. Primates have been on this Earth 57 to 85 million years, so a little while. Now, humans. You knew it was coming. How long have humans been riding around the center of the galaxy on this planet? It's actually it's there already. The arrow was there. There it is. See, that's it. Humans have made it about 0.13% of the way around the black hole at the center of the Milky Way. So, yeah, 13% of 1% of the way. We haven't gone far enough yet for the view to change, right? We are newcomers. We haven't even been here 1 million years. We've been here 300,000 years. Compare that to the insects. 480 million years. This is their planet. Really, it is. And it's been shaped by them for all of that time. So now that we are here and we're interacting with this world and the plants that are on it, those plants were shaped by the insects the whole time, from day one. And now here we are, we arrive, and we want to understand them. So we need to understand their shared history with the insects. Now, plants. This is a talk at a plant meeting. So how about the first land plants? First land plants, 480 million years. Where have I seen that number before? The land plants turn up at the same time as the insects, together. So now I'm going to go through time from long ago to now and kind of tell you some snippets of what we know about this shared history between plants and animals and plants and insects and mostly trees and insects. But it doesn't start with trees. I'll go a little further back just to, place some context on how tightly these things have been working together from day one. We'll go back to the Archean period. And by the way, these illustrations are all by different artists who some were contracted by museums to illustrate a period given what we know, or for books or articles. And I think that this type of art is extremely valuable because it helps us get our head around what we have learned from the scientific world and the fossil record in a way that engages our imagination and allows us to sort of envision what was happening. It's different from me throwing a bunch of graphs at you or a bunch of pictures of detailed fossils. So I'm going to use a lot of these in this talk. So here's the Archean period. And this is the period when we have the first evidence of these algal mats. And they are the first plants, they're also first life, and they're photosynthesizing. They're getting energy from the sun and capturing carbon dioxide and building their bodies. They're all in the oceans, but this is a crazy looking world. If you went to this world, you would die. You'd be dead. The atmosphere is poisonous. It's full of hydrogen sulfide. It has zero oxygen, none. Also, it's hot. There are a lot of volcanoes, a lot of volcanic gases. A lot of meteors are still falling in because there's a lot more debris in Earth's orbit that's still getting chunked in. And look at that giant moon. Here's another illustration of the Archean period. I like this one. Look at that moon. So early in Earth's formation, we now know that the moon was actually spun out by a massive impact between two planetoids. Earth got smacked, and part of it was absorbed into the Earth and part of it was ejected. And the moon, early on, is very close to the Earth, and the Earth is spinning, it has 5-hour days. It's spinning really, really fast. But it's been knocked off center, which is why we have seasons. Which is cool, right? But the moon is also very hot. So initially, there are like two balls of lava, and the moon is pulling on the Earth with super strong tides because it's so close. In fact, it's so close that if you looked at it in the sky as it was rising, it would take about 8 degrees of the horizon. So if you imagine a clock around you, it's past maybe 1 o'clock, noon to 1 is the moon. And not only that, it's covered with lava fields and volcanoes, so it glows, and you can see all that terrain and volcanism on the moon really close, lighting up the sky. And it's so bright, reflecting the sun, that there's no real nighttime. Crazy planet. So it's pulling these mile-high lava tides on the Earth. Things have finally calmed down enough, but the moon is still really close. And the life on this planet are these stromatolites, which are these blobs in the ocean. And they are algal mats. They're a whole ecosystem of different algae and cyanobacteria and archaea and bacteria doing their things, living in a little micro mat, probably very interesting down at their scale. And they're building up layer upon layer upon layer on these blobs that are also capturing sediments. And these fossilize really nicely, so we have a lot of them today. But that's life. There it is. Land is barren. Barren rock eroding away. And oxygen hasn't entered the atmosphere yet. Oxygen doesn't accumulate for this really long time. So the numbers down on the x-axis are billions of years. And the red and green lines are estimates for the, like high and low estimates for the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. And you see cyanobacteria turn up maybe 2.5 billion in numbers here. But the amount of oxygen goes up a little bit, and then it just flatlines, like super low. And oxygen doesn't increase in the atmosphere in any meaningful way until less than 1 billion years ago. So what was happening? What's happening is that the oceans are rusting. On this planet, when there's no oxygen, iron doesn't rust. And metallic iron is soluble in water. So there's a bunch of iron dissolved in the ocean, and then on land there's a bunch of iron sitting there. So as these little bitty plants are pumping out their oxygen, capturing CO2, pumping out oxygen, each oxygen molecule is going and rusting a bit of iron. And then that rust, red rust, does not dissolve in water. And so it falls like snow in the oceans, and it builds up in layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. And these are called the banded iron formations. And they're all over the world in different places, and they are where we mine all our iron that we use today to build things. We mine the banded iron. But it's all from the rusting of the oceans. until finally we reach the great oxygenation event, which is the point at which there's no more free iron laying around to rust easily, and oxygen starts building up in the atmosphere. And this is the groundwork that plants laid for animals. We can't have multicellular animals on this planet yet until there's an atmosphere to support them with lots of oxygen. And so the plants, for all that period of time, even though they're, unicellular little cyanobacteria, have been changing the geology and the chemistry of the world to the point that animals can come on the scene. This is also probably the first mass extinction. A lot of those early bacteria and things died because suddenly there's all this oxygen in the atmosphere, and oxygen is actually really toxic. It's super electron hungry, and it will tear electrons off of any number of molecules, including ones in your body. That's why we take antioxidants like vitamin C, things like that. But these first life forms had no defenses. No vitamin C, nothing to protect their cells, and so they're shredded, they're rusted by the oxygen. But the ones that survive adapt, and the world changes. So skip forward in time a little bit. This is maybe my most favorite period of time because it's so mysterious. This is an artist's depiction of the Ediacaran. It's right before the Cambrian explosion. And this is a point in time where animals have evolved and complex multicellular bodies have evolved. And the plants are still doing this algal thing, although they're in more complicated algal mats and even little fronds of algae in the oceans. But look at this world. What are those things? These are all depictions of things that were here, that were animals, that we have fossils of. Some were pretty big. And most of them are fixed in place. They don't move around, right? They're rooted where they are. Most of them are probably filter feeders. What are they doing? Who are they? Do they even have any living relatives? There may be things in this world that go extinct at the point that true animals come on the scene, and there's nothing related to them ever since, right? Well, we don't know because we only have the fossils. We can't look at their DNA. We don't know so much about them. But there's one thing in this world that is the hint of what is about to come. And that are these little tracks in the mud. Do you see that? Somebody is moving around. Someone has evolved the ability to change their location, which up to this point in time, through all those billions of years, no life really had that ability. It could get passively, washed away or moved that way, but to have control of where you go is a superpower. And that is the superpower that propels all of the animals onto the stage and changes the world forever for the plants. This is the point at which plants seriously have to up their game. Because up to then, right, they could just be where they are doing their thing. And the only way they'd get munched on is if one of these animals settled and ended up right next to them. Now, someone is in this muck who can move around and go and chew on them. Not only that, something else crazy is happening, which is burrowing. Up to this point, sediments just came down in gentle layers. Nothing disturbed it because nothing could dig, except maybe a natural disaster, a landslide, things like that. Suddenly, there are animals, and we actually don't know who made these tracks. We just have the tracks from this period. Something is burrowing around, and it's turning up all the muck, and it's uprooting stuff and putting junk on top of the plants and rooting through them and eating them. And that is a massive change. It's called bioturbation in the substrate that plants have to adapt to. So there are additional extinctions in some plants and other organisms due to these pressures of things being able to move and being able to turn up the sediments. The world changes, and as soon as something gets the ability to move around, they've got the advantage. There's an evolutionary arms race and a lot of diversification. If one thing can move, then something else could move and munch on it. And this is the point in time that's called the Cambrian explosion. It's called an explosion. We named it that because it's like a million types of animals just explode onto the scene all at once. Evolution happens extremely rapidly, and there's an explosion of animal life still in the seas. So this is a nice depiction of some of those creatures. They look rather mysterious. If you came to this planet, good news, you'd be able to breathe, but it would look like a totally alien landscape, and all the life would be in the ocean, maybe with the exception of a little algae scum where it's really wet on land. And look at these creatures. They're doing stuff. There were still a lot of algal mats, but they were sort of more restricted in where they could be and maybe needed to develop some defenses. I might talk about that tomorrow a bit. But fundamentally, this is the planet of the bugs. Earth was covered with super diverse creatures. There were a lot of trilobites. But the arthropods, which include soon-to-be insects, they're sort of the ancestor group of the insects, and also things like sea spiders, spiders, horseshoe crabs, millipedes, all those things that are crunchy on the outside and have legs. And arthropods are the majority of all the animal types doing the majority of all the stuff because they have the most adaptable body. They have a body that's made up of segments that are just repeated using the same DNA to make segment, 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 segment. It's like the clone stamp of animals. And each segment comes with a pair of legs, or 2 pairs for some of these. And it's very easy once you've got repeated, replicated bits of genes to take one set and say, oh, well, we'll modify this gene to make claws, or to make antennae, or to make paddles, or to make gills. So it gives evolution a lot to work with, because if you have only one copy of a gene for something important and you have a mutation, you might have destroyed that gene for the important thing. But if you have multiple copies expressed in different places in your body, you've just copy-pasted it, then you can keep the good one even if you end up with a mutation, even if it's a bad mutation, on another one. And through time, evolution will push and select for things that end up with advantageous things, like modified limbs. So this is the animal explosion. And notice these all have several features. They have the ability to move around, either swimming or crawling or digging. And they have a head with eyeballs. Once you can move, it makes sense to have a front and a back. And if you have a front and you're going somewhere, you need sensors to figure out what you're going to run into. And that's what life does. Animals that move, they end up with cephalization. They end up with a head, and they end up with sensors like eyes and antennae and stuff. And that means that they can see where they're going, and they can be looking for those plants and looking for things to chew on, and they have more control over what they're doing. So again, this is putting a lot of pressure on the plants to up their game. Maybe they can take on forms that are more sophisticated than a layer of slime. So let's go to land. This has all been in the ocean so far, but land is just sitting there waiting to be colonized. And it's in the Ordovician, 480 million years ago, when we have the first evidence of plants creeping onto land and the first evidence of insects creeping onto land, right about at the same time. And the first plants were not very inspiring from our perspective, right? They were mostly encrusting things, maybe like early liverworts or little moss-like things. But still, they're colonizing this very different habitat. They have to tolerate being in the atmosphere, being bombarded by solar radiation, wind. It's a different world. They need to be able to root themselves to the ground somehow and attach. They need to be able to transport water through their bodies. They need a different strategy for reproducing. So this is an artist's depiction of what this might have looked like. And this is maybe, we could argue that this is the first forest, right? I mean, okay, so these are moss-like things, and they're maybe yay high. But there's nothing taller on land. And if there are any insects, they're a lot smaller. So from their perspective, everything is relative, right? So from the perspective of other living things on land, this is a forest right here. But as soon as things colonize land and plants start getting the ability to organize their bodies into more complex land-plant forms, it's yet another sort of arms race. Because, of course, if I'm this tall, but my neighbor is this tall, they're getting more sun. So, by the Silurian, vascular plants appear on the stage, and vascular plants are able to be taller because they have xylem and phloem. They're able to move fluids through their body and take nutrients from the ground, take water from the ground, move it up, and move products of photosynthesis throughout their body. So they're bigger, they're more complex, they've got more going on. They're reproducing with spores like mosses do. And the insects at this point in time are probably still quite small and mostly down underneath of these things. I'm sure they're nibbling on them. We don't have a lot of great insect fossils from this point in time, though. So we don't really know what they were doing. But safe to say, they were probably doing insect things. There's another thing in this picture, this sort of the elephant in the room, the prototaxites. These are giant things. We have many fossils of them. They could be up to 3 feet across and up to 26 feet high. And we have no idea what they were. They were on land at this time. They were quite abundant in some places. For a very long time, scientists' best guess was that they were giant fungi, like big mushroom things. But there's very recent study, just in the last couple weeks, that came out where they looked at the chemistry of the fossils, because a lot of chemicals in organisms actually remain. You can still analyze a lot of chemistry in a fossilized organism. And these things have 0 chitin in them, which makes up the body of insects, it makes up the body of mushrooms. And the best guess now is that this is some other lineage of life that didn't make it past this point and is related to nothing else on Earth today. Nothing. They had tubular, almost like foam structure in their trunks, and they were weird, and they were very large. So we could call them a tree as well. This is an alien world. In some ways, it's more Earth-like from our perspective because now there's some planty things on land, at least. But if you went to this world, you would not be convinced that you were on Earth. This is a very odd place. And there's nothing in the air, right? Nothing can fly. If there are insects, they're down on the ground, no wings. But one thing the insects were doing at this time that we know of is that many of these prototaxites fossils have holes bored into them. So someone was chewing and digging. So they must have tasted good to some insect, whatever they are. Let's skip ahead in time a little bit to the first real forests. Finally, halfway through the talk, we get to trees at the tree conference. Here is an artist's rendition of the Devonian, which is still a long time ago. That 519 is wrong, by the way. It should be, I think, 319. Anyway, so 359 million years ago. And these are the first trees. No, I think it's 419, sorry. This is when, from space, the world would really start to look green. Because it takes really forests to make a continent look green from space. If you think about like the Southwest from space, it's still got a lot of brown on it. And these plants are genuinely large. These would be forest-sized to you and I if we were to walk around. The world is warm, the world is wet, and plants are thriving because they've gotten big, and in some ways they've kind of outpaced their little insect herbivores, right? They've gotten tall, and insects aren't really equipped for climbing and flying yet. And they are more armored. There are things that are actually woody here. And so plants are developing some of that cellular structure that defends them from being just chewed to bits immediately. They're no longer soft and squishy. They also have a lot more structure and even different life stages. The very first seeds turn up here. The very first real soil turns up here. So enough plant material has piled up and plants have done enough modification of the rocks that legitimate soil is turning up. And this changes the whole planet geologically, because up to this point, rivers and stuff just were big straightaways, like a big wash, almost like an avalanche chute going out to the ocean. And they don't take on their meandering form that we see so many places now until there are plant roots to hold the ground together. And so it changes the rate of erosion. It changes the rate of nutrients going into the ocean. It changes the rate of different molecules going into the air. So I'll come back to that in a second. But what did the insects look like at this point? We have the first insect fossil here. We know that insects were around before this using dated DNA phylogenies, but this is a diagram of the possible Devonian insect fossil. I say possible because its legs sadly didn't fossilize, and we know that insects have 6 legs, so unless we can count the legs, we don't know for sure if this is like a crustacean on its way to being an insect or if it's truly an insect. But it sure looks a lot like some modern branches of the insect tree that branched off very early around this time, like silverfish and bristletails. Those are very early kind of relic taxa on the insect tree. And they were probably doing about the same thing that bristletails and such do today, rummaging in the detritus, chewing on things. You note that it has nice chewing mandibles. Now, how about the trees? How are our tree fossils? Our tree fossils are awesome. So in fact, we don't just have tree fossils from the Devonian, we have fossil forests. This is a picture of tree at Cairo fossil forest. These are in New York. There's also Gilboa fossil forest. And here they've placed a bucket where the stump was, and those are the roots going out. That's a huge tree. And there are whole forests of these. There are also trunk segments that have fossilized. And these trees were so big, they're pulling so much carbon dioxide out of the air that we think that they are the thing that causes the mass extinction at the end of this Devonian period. Because if you pull enough CO2 out of the air, the planet cools down a lot, and it ends with an abrupt glaciation. Things get real cold real fast. The other thing that these trees are doing is they're digging all these huge roots in, and they're really turning up the ground, and there is a big pulse of nutrients from the soil being flushed out to sea, and it causes a whole bunch of big algal blooms that suck up a bunch of CO2 and then drop to the bottom and fossilize with that CO2. So an abrupt end to an awesome period. But let me show you these trees, first real trees. This is Eospermatopterus, which is the one whose roots are in that previous picture. Artist's rendition has a big woody trunk with big roots, and then it goes way, way, way up, and then it has kind of a tree ferny top. They're quite tall. Here are a couple others. Archaeopteris, not the bird, but Archaeopteris, is kind of another tree ferny thing. It has a real woody trunk, however, and it really is tree-shaped. In some ways, it's almost like pine tree-shaped in structure, but it's still acting more like a fern. And then my personal favorite, lepidendron. So lepidendron is a gigantic club moss, tree-sized, if you can imagine that. And I particularly love the juvenile stage, where it's growing tall and it's got this root base and this like totally funky thing. There are some drawn in this picture. So the things that look vaguely like Joshua trees there, I'm pretty sure are supposed to be lepidendron. So a wild world. So what happens after that accidental CO2 plunge and freezing? Well, the world warms back up, it adjusts, everything balances out a couple million years, and we reach the Carboniferous, 359 to 299 million years ago. And now, trees have really reached like ultimate treedom. They're huge, they're woody, they're all different shapes. The world is covered with essentially like big, wet, ultra hot rainforests and forest swamps full of life. It's thick with life. And because there's so much structure, now insects have a reason to go up. Right? So habitat has gone from being pretty two-dimensional to being very three-dimensional thanks to the trees. And so in the Carboniferous, in response, the insects quickly evolved the ability to fly. And they're the first animals to fly. Nothing else to this point has moved into the atmosphere that isn't rooted to the ground. And there's a ton of oxygen in the atmosphere at this point in time. So insects aren't as limited in their respiratory system as they are today. They can get larger. So how large? Large. So the largest known terrestrial arthropod is actually this relative of the millipedes, which is kind of great. It was about 8 feet long, and we have fossils of it. We also have a lot of fossils of its tracks, and they look like tractor tires, awesome beast. I assume that's been going around chewing on all these plants that have evolved. The sea scorpion there, the crazy-looking thing, is a spider relative that's in the ocean. So that's one of the biggest predators of the ocean, that's sort of like doing shark-type stuff. And then dragonflies and relatives of dragonflies are enormous aerial predators flying around catching things, including small vertebrates. And they had a wingspan up to 28 inches. Huge. Now, what are insects doing here? Well, we can assume that they're chewing on and eating all these plants, but they're coming up with new ways to do that. For instance, here is a Carboniferous fossil of a gull on a horsetail. So we know that gall making goes back at least this far, and some of the other sort of herbivory lifestyles beyond the blunt force chewing may also start to appear. So I won't show you a lot of phylogenies in this talk for want of time and detail, but the one point I want to make with this evolutionary tree of the insects, I've highlighted in green this period in time, and that's the period in time when a lot of big groups of insects branch all together. And in particular, the flying insects really diversify in this thick jungle. And no wonder, because they have things to climb on and jump off of and fly through. And they were very large. There were many types of them. So there's a couple of megapleura and things there. The other thing about this period and the forests in the Carboniferous, it's called the Carboniferous because massive amounts of wood and plant matter starts to accumulate. This is the first time that plants are pulling out so much CO2 and making it into plant that stuff is really piling up. And the insects and other animals haven't really caught up on the breaking it down and eating it part. And so it starts to pile up. Not only that, but there's swampy land in a lot of these places. And so it can go down into the water and sort of pile up like a peat bog does today. And as you go down in all that organic material, it very quickly becomes anoxic, and then it's very hard for anything to break it down. So these forests literally just accumulate massive amounts of bonded CO2 that piles up in the sediment for millions of years. And that's a great resource. That's a lot of energy if someone could eat it. But unfortunately, termites haven't evolved yet. And probably the only thing at this point in time that is able to break up cellulose and lignin and things that make up tree parts are the fungi. But clearly more built up than could be broken down. And that is where most of our coal comes from. This is the Carboniferous, because most layers of coal on Earth are piles of this forest. And in many coal places, you can break it and you'll actually see the leaves or a bit of wood. It's all plant and tree from this time. So this leads us to an interesting thing, right? Because if you're burning coal, say in this power plant, you are getting heat energy by breaking those carbon-carbon bonds that were made using sunlight, heat and light captured in the Carboniferous. So you're literally just releasing 300 million year old sunlight. That's what that is. It's energy from the sun 300 million years ago. It's just kind of neat when you think about it that way. So we'll leave the Carboniferous now and we'll go to the Permian. At this point in time, there's sort of an increase in sophistication in both the insects and the plants. The plants now, this is when we get the first gymnosperms in the Permian. It's a little drier, it's a little cooler, there's a little more variation in habitats around the world. And this is when you see the first conifers, the real pine trees, the ginkgos, and the cycads. And some of the insect groups that we recognize today turn up for the very first time in the fossil record. So now the very first beetles turn up. And the beetles are doing something interesting. This is a cycad, and they have these great big cones full of pollen. And they're pollinated today by two types of insects, little thrips and beetles, both of which turn up first in the Permian. And this may be the first time that insects cooperate with plants in pollination. So the plant probably is not initially making cones to attract insects, but it's a good food source, a big cone full of pollen. And so insects are going to use that as a food source. And if they're moving between plants, they're going to transfer pollen, which is more advantageous for the plant. It's more likely to be outcrossed and have high quality offspring. And so there's selection for plants that do more to attract insects. And insects, of course, can take advantage of this food source. So this may be the first time that real pollination happens. So things are going well. Permian's looking good. It's looking more and more like our current planet, although still pretty weird. And then the worst thing that ever happened that we humans know about happens. Ever. This is a truly terrible event. There's kind of no comparison to this event, the end of the Permian. This is when life on Earth almost died out completely. All trees go extinct, and they don't reappear for at least 10 million years. Gone. 30 to 60% of insects die, and 85 to 95% of all species, oceans and land, they die. Everything dies. And what is left is grim. There are a few weedy species. If this was today, it would be like tumbleweeds and cockroaches for 10 million years. That's it. Seriously. Only the tumbleweed of this time is, I think it's a lycopode, but similarly, there's like 3 kinds of things, and it's grim. And what happened was that the Siberian traps opened up. So on this map, the black on this map of Russia, that big black blob, is the extent of a gigantic basalt lava flow. It's not even a volcano. It's a giant hundreds of miles long, rent in the earth, spewing out mile-deep lava. And it's worse, it gets worse, okay? Because this is happening, and then it hits that layer of coal, which is all of the previous era's profligate making of trees and making lots and lots and lots and lots of preserved carbon, and it sets it on fire underground, and it burns it all at once, and dumps all the carbon from that area's previous 50 million years of time into the atmosphere, quickly. And it is so bad, it heats the planet to such an extent that the oceans reach about 105 degrees. And you can tell a lot from rock chemistry, actually. And when they get that hot, they also acidify from all the dissolved carbon dioxide. They become anoxic to within like a foot of the surface. Everything dies, and it sinks down and rots in an anoxic way that releases hydrogen sulfide gas, which is the sewer gas. You know, I've heard of accidents where people fall into a septic tank or a manure pit and they die because at over, you know, a few hundred parts per million of hydrogen sulfide, you die. It's poison. Imagine the whole ocean doing that. And so most things died, and it took a very long time to recover. This is the extinction that took the longest to recover from in the history of the Earth. And so here's the good news. Trees, when finally, after 10, 15 million years, things start to recover, trees come back. They come back, even though they went through this truly horrific thing. And so do the insects. And so do a lot of the vertebrate animals, although not all of them. And the world is different, but the world is okay. And this is the Triassic. This is when the dinosaurs really take the stage. But it's also when, so gymnosperms come back. Many groups of the modern insects really start to diversify. We get the beetles, and we get the sucking bugs, and the flies, and the sawflies, which are the first insects to be able to put their eggs into hard wood. They've got a little saw blade ovipositor. Now, the Jurassic, skipping forward in time a little bit more, is also a world of gymnosperms. This is when dinosaurs really hit their stride, you know. I think there's a movie about that. And this is when the very first flowering plants turn up. This is still not our world. Up to this point, there are no flowers. There are no fruits. There are none of the soft-leaved things that we have in our salad. It's tough. But in the Jurassic, dinosaurs are huge. They're diverse, and they can eat these really tough plants. By the way, okay, so now the insects have more to contend with. Some of the dinosaurs are quite good at flying at this point and can start to catch insects out of the air. So insects suddenly need to up their game for more than interacting with plants. This is actually a lacewing. Moths and butterflies haven't evolved yet, but it's placed next to a modern one because look at the eye spots on the wings. Those are still on this lacewing as a startle mechanism to hopefully scare the dinosaur that's trying to catch it. But here is what the dinosaurs are eating. So most Jurassic plants don't have flowers, and stuff is getting tougher and tougher. Imagine eating a cycad. I bring my students a leaf off a cycad and ask them, would you like to eat this? You can stab yourself with it. But there's a few plants starting to do some things we would recognize. So ginkgo is one of the first things to have something resembling a fruit. There's kind of a fleshy offering on the outside of the seed. And they don't smell good. And insects are now doing things like pretending to be plants. On the one side here, on the right, is a picture of a fossil of the ginkgo leaf. And next to it is a picture of the fossil of an insect found with that ginkgo. It's even surrounded with ginkgo seeds. And you can see that it is shaped just like the leaf. It's trying to blend in so it won't be eaten. So insects are starting to have much more of a complicated relationship with plants. And now we're getting to where things really start to look like our world. in the Cretaceous, the angiosperms, the flowering plants, arrive on the scene. And angiosperms have fruit, they have flowers, all those wonderful things that are really about relationships with insects and with other animals. They're about pollinate me, I'll give you something, or protect me, or disperse my seeds. The world is becoming more interlaced in relationships and less of a just sort of herbivore food relationship, although there's still plenty of that going on. So with these soft, juicy, delicious angiosperm leaves, as soon as they turn up, we get leaf miner fossils. So insects are not far behind in developing new strategies to feed on plants. And this is when the sucking bugs diversify. You get all your scale insects and your aphids and your leafhoppers, all the things that pierce and suck. And this is also when bees diversify. And they only are able to diversify because suddenly plants are offering them pollen and nectar and a lifestyle of participating in pollination with plants. And in turn, the abundance of bees pushes plants to ever more interesting forms of flowers. And so you see this reciprocal coevolution of insects and flowering plants through time. This is also when the ants explode in diversity. And it's when the insects that undergo complete metamorphosis really take the stage. If you think about it, with something like a caterpillar and a butterfly, the caterpillar is one organism. It has a lifestyle, it has a diet, it does its thing, it crawls around, and it's got little legs and chewing mouth, and it eats plant parts. Then it goes into this dormant stage, and it could wait out a drought or a season while it's doing that. And then it comes out as a totally different animal, doing totally different things, eating different things. It can fly. It doesn't even have the same body. And so there are all these cases where now the insect can participate in different relationships with plants at different points in its life. It might be an herbivore as juvenile and then come out as the mutualist pollinator as the adult. Now, of course, splat. Disaster strikes again, the end of the Cretaceous. And I won't do it tons of justice since I'm running out of time, but suffice to say, this one was bad, but not bad like end Permian bad. Now, there was a mile-high tsunami that went all the way around the Earth and bumped back and swept debris all the way into like the Midwest. And there was world-consuming wildfire that did kill all the trees on the Earth. Luckily, seeds survived in the seed bank. And there were years of darkness, but life goes on. And we reached the Paleogene. And this is finally, 65 million years ago, we reached the point in time that looks like our world, at least a little bit. And this world, after this disaster, is when the angiosperms take over. Up to this point, angiosperms are cool. They have flowers. They're a part of the ecosystem, but they're not the dominant part. But after this, they are. Fun fact, since you're plant people, this happened in May or June. And we know that because of fossilized pollen at the layer where the charcoal and the burning and the disaster is, which is pretty cool. Okay, so here's our world. By the time we get to the Miocene, it kind of looks like Earth today, except with awesome megafauna. And these habitats, we also get more C4 plants. They're more efficient in using their CO2. But we have a dominance of plants that are wrapped up in these tight interrelationships with many, many types of animals, with insects that are feeding on them, insects that are burrowing in them, insects that are modifying their soil, insects that are pollinating them, insects that are protecting them. And you really can't fully understand a modern angiosperm plant without understanding all of those relationships that it's participating in and that have shaped it. So that brings me to the end. That's the story of Earth by me. It's insects and plants. So I think we're out of time, but anybody has questions and wants to hang out, I'm around, and I'm around tomorrow. So, do we have time for questions? I think, sure.
Any questions? Mike was off. Hello, Mike. Okay, let's call it a wrap for today. Thank you so much, and see you tomorrow.